Jake found his mailbox destroyed, with a note, "You've broken the rules." What started as petty vandalism soon revealed itself as something far more dangerous, an unspoken law that could change his life forever. But what happened next will shock even those who've seen it all. Let's start from the beginning. It was a Saturday morning when Jake Thompson, a software developer known for his quiet demeanor and reserved lifestyle, stepped outside to collect his mail. The familiar sight of his mailbox, a small but proud feature of his front yard, immediately caught his attention. Something was wrong. The bright red flag, which usually stood tall against the morning sky, was torn off, and the box itself lay in pieces on the grass. Jake stood frozen for a moment, processing the scene. There was no sign of who had done this, no shattered glass, no stray markings, just the remnants of his mailbox scattered across the lawn. The only indication of why it had happened was a crumpled piece of paper that had somehow survived the destruction. He unfolded it carefully, recognizing the emblem of the HOA. It was a notice informing him that he was in violation of some obscure property code, a regulation he had never heard of before. The words were formal, impersonal, like a cold reminder from a distant authority. His frustration started to bubble up, a mix of anger and disbelief. The HOA, a group he'd always tried to avoid, had seemingly overstepped its bounds. He had always followed the rules, kept his yard tidy, and never made waves. But this was different. They hadn't even given him a chance to correct whatever mistake they thought he'd made. No warning, no phone call, just a wrecked mailbox and a vague note. It felt personal, and that angered him more than anything. Jake's heart raced as he stood there, staring at the pieces of his mailbox. His mind scrambled to understand. How had it come to this? Was this really just a small violation of an obscure rule, or was there something more to it? For the first time, Jake felt the weight of the HOA's reach, and it left him feeling powerless. Jake's anger simmered, rising in waves as he thought about the HOA board members. The smug faces of these self-appointed guardians of suburban order flashed in his mind. They were the kind of people who took pleasure in enforcing the smallest, most trivial rules, believing they were somehow above everyone else. It wasn't just about a mailbox. It was about principle. For years, Jake had watched in silence as the HOA's grip on his neighborhood grew tighter, more controlling. They had their fingers in every aspect of daily life, dictating everything from the height of grass on his lawn to the exact shade of paint his front door could be. Over time, their demands became more invasive, more ridiculous. But Jake had always played along, keeping his head down, hoping things would change. But now, this was too much. The mailbox, something so simple and unimportant in the grand scheme of life, had become the symbol of everything he hated about the HOA. The mailbox wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. Jake had been a target for the HOA for years. He was the one they always singled out, the one they constantly fined for the smallest infractions. Maybe it was his refusal to conform. Maybe it was his attitude. But no matter how hard he tried to follow their rules, there was always something, some petty infraction they could use to make his life difficult. Now they had gone too far. He couldn't let it slide this time. He wouldn't. His frustration deepened as he thought about the other homeowners in the neighborhood, the ones too afraid to speak up, too terrified to challenge the HOA's iron grip. They were intimidated, bullied into submission by the board's arbitrary enforcement of rules. Jake wasn't going to be another one of them. He was done letting them get away with it. His blood boiled as he made a decision, one that would change everything. It was time to fight back. Jake wasn't going to sit back and let this slide. He couldn't. Not after everything the HOA had put him through. This time, he would fight back. He threw himself into research, determined to find any loophole, any provision that could turn the tide in his favor. Hours turned into days as he dug through endless pages of HOA regulations and local property codes. It felt tedious, but his anger fueled him, each discovery adding fuel to the fire. Then, buried deep within the legal jargon, he found something that made his pulse race: a property law that required the HOA to provide improved facilities or infrastructure if they destroyed something on a resident's property. It was an obscure rule, one he had never heard of before, and yet it was exactly what he needed. It was his lifeline. Jake's heart raced as he realized the potential this law held. Not only could he demand a replacement for his destroyed mailbox, but he could also push for something better. This was his chance to turn the tables. Armed with this newfound weapon, Jake began drafting his response. He wasn't going to play nice this time. His email was sharp, carefully written, and left no room for negotiation. He demanded a new, improved mailbox, one that met his expectations, and reimbursement for the damages done to his property. The HOA had been accustomed to pushing people around, to ignoring their concerns and getting away with it. Jake was determined to change that. When the HOA received his email, their initial reaction was exactly what he expected: dismissive and condescending. They tried to brush him off, labeling his demands as ridiculous, an overreaction. For them, it was just another annoying resident making noise. But Jake wasn't going to let them get away with it this time. He had the law on his side, and he wasn't going anywhere. The more they ignored him, the more determined he became. Jake knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that sometimes the only way to win against bullies was to hit them where it hurt, with persistence, knowledge, and the law. A week passed, and the back and forth between Jake and the HOA escalated. At first, the board had dismissed him, thinking his demands were just another nuisance to ignore. But Jake didn't back down. He kept pushing, relentlessly, using every piece of the legal puzzle he had painstakingly put together. The HOA tried to stall, hoping he'd tire or give up, but they underestimated his determination and his knowledge. Then, finally, they caved. The email Jake had sent demanding an upgraded mailbox hadn't just been a complaint. It had been a wake-up call. In the end, the HOA agreed to install a brand new, luxurious mailbox, one far better than the old battered one they had destroyed. It was sleek, modern, and reinforced, a clear sign that they had not only lost the fight, but had been forced to bend to Jake's will. As Jake stood in front of the newly installed mailbox, a sense of satisfaction settled over him. It wasn't just about the mailbox anymore. It was about principle. The HOA had come to realize that Jake wasn't someone they could push around, and that was a hard lesson for them to learn. They had been arrogant, thinking they could keep destroying things and bullying residents without consequence. Now they had to face the result of their own overreach. Jake didn't just win a victory for himself. He won it for every homeowner who had ever felt powerless against the HOA's tyranny. He had stood up for what was right, and the system had bent to his will. It felt good, that sense of justice. It wasn't just about the law. It was about proving that sometimes the little guy could win, that persistence and principle could beat the odds. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a renewed faith in fighting for what he believed in. The fight wasn't always easy, but standing up for yourself, and for others, made the victory all the sweeter.